Maddie had always believed in hard work. It was the one thing her mother had drilled into her since childhood, that success wasn't given, it was earned. And Maddie had spent her whole life doing exactly that, pushing forward, making smart decisions, ensuring that she and her son, Levi, had the kind of stability she had grown up with. They weren't rich, but they never struggled. They weren't elite, but doors always seemed to open. She told herself it was because of her mother's careful planning. Her mother had been a woman of foresight, someone who had made sure Maddie had gone to the right schools, met the right people, and understood how to carry herself in a world that rewarded preparation. And yet, sometimes, Maddie wondered. Her life was good. A little too good. When she applied for jobs, she got them. When she needed an apartment, the perfect one was always available, affordable, well-maintained, in a safe neighborhood. Levi had been accepted into an elite private school without her ever needing to beg or pull strings. When she worried about finances, a promotion or bonus seemed to materialize just in time. It wasn't luck. Maddie didn't believe in luck. Still, she had never questioned it. Not really. Why would she? She arrived at work expecting another uneventful day. A morning filled with back-to-back emails, a department meeting at 10, a long-winded conference call in the afternoon. But as soon as she opened her inbox, she felt a shift. The subject line from HR read, "Promotion Opportunity." She sat up straighter. She hadn't applied for anything. Clicking the email, she scanned the details. A significant salary increase. An executive position she hadn't even considered herself a contender for. An office on the top floor with her own team to manage. Her stomach flipped. This had to be a mistake. She walked down to HR, her heels clicking against the polished floor, rehearsing how she would politely ask them to double-check their records. But when she got there, the HR representative beamed at her like she had just won an award. "We're so happy for you, Maddie," the woman said. "This is incredibly well-deserved." Maddie hesitated. I didn't even know this position was open." "The decision was made internally," the woman said, flipping through some paperwork. "You've been on our radar for a while." Maddie stared at her. On their radar? She had been working here for years, steadily moving up, but this? This was a jump, not a step. She should have been thrilled. This was everything she had worked for. And yet. By noon, she was in her new office, an ultramodern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. A desk larger than her dining table. A coffee machine that probably cost more than her monthly grocery bill. It felt wrong. She called her best friend Elena during lunch. "That's incredible," Elena said, her voice bright with excitement. "You've worked your ass off for this." "I have," Maddie admitted, turning in her chair, staring at the view. "But that's not the part that's bothering me." Elena sighed. "Oh God, you're not about to say something insane like you don't deserve this, are you?" Maddie bit her lip. "Come on," Elena pressed. "You've always had this thing where you can't just accept good things happening to you. It's allowed to be easy sometimes." "Yeah, but this easy?" Maddie rubbed her forehead. "It's like, things just keep working out." "Maybe because you're talented?" Elena teased. "You ever think of that?" "I don't know. It's just weird." Elena groaned. "Maddie. You got a promotion. Enjoy it." Maddie laughed, but the feeling in her gut didn't ease. She spent the rest of the day distracted, hyper-aware of how unnatural it felt to have moved up so fast. By the time she picked up Levi from school, her mind was still buzzing. Levi slid into the back seat, tossing his backpack to the floor like it offended him. "Hey, bud," she said, adjusting the rearview mirror. "Hey," he muttered, scrolling through his phone. "Good day?" "Yeah. Anything exciting happen?" He shrugged. Got picked for the debate team. Maddie frowned. I thought you didn't try out. I didn't. She gripped the steering wheel. Another thing falling into place. After dinner, she tried to shake it off. She cleaned up, helped Levi with his math homework, went through work emails. By 10, the house was quiet. Levi had retreated to his room to play games, and Maddie finally sat down at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. That's when she saw it. A letter, sitting on the floor just inside the front door. She frowned. She hadn't heard the mail arrive. She stood, crossing the room, bending down to pick it up. There was no return address, no stamp. Just her mother's name, written in elegant handwriting. Her breath caught. Her mother had been gone for nearly a decade. She swallowed hard, carefully sliding a finger under the flap, unfolding the paper inside. The message was brief. Everything you have was promised. If you wish to leave, you must be certain, there is no return. Maddie's heart pounded. She read it again. Then a third time. She sat down, gripping the paper, staring at the ink like it might rearrange itself into something more logical. What did this mean? She looked around, her pulse thrumming in her ears, suddenly feeling watched. The house was quiet. Levi's bedroom door was still shut. There was no one outside the window. Still, the sensation of something unseen lingered. She pressed the letter flat against the table. Everything you have was promised. Promised by who? Her mother had worked for everything they had. Hadn't she? Hadn't Maddie? And the second part, if you wish to leave, you must be certain, there is no return. What did that mean? Leave what? The house? The job? Her life? A chill ran down her spine. She should have thrown the letter away, dismissed it as some cruel prank. But she didn't. She folded it back up and placed it in the drawer beside her, feeling uneasy in a way she never had before. For the first time, Maddie had the sinking realization that her life wasn't hers alone. Maddie had spent her entire life believing she was in control. That every decision she made, every job she took, every apartment she rented, every opportunity that landed in her lap, was the result of careful planning, relentless work, and a touch of good fortune. But the letter had shattered that illusion. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the words repeated in her mind like a taunt. Everything you have was promised. What did that mean? Promised by whom? And to whom? By morning, she was no closer to an answer, only a certainty that she couldn't let it go. She pulled out her laptop, ignoring her usual routine of checking emails and scanning news headlines. Instead, she started searching. She went through every official document tied to her name, her birth records, her mother's employment history, every lease and bank account she had ever held. Nothing seemed unusual. No hidden trusts. No unexpected windfalls. But as she pieced through her childhood, she began to notice things she had never questioned before. The house she had grown up in wasn't owned by her mother. There was no record of a mortgage or a rental agreement in her mother's name. School tuition payments had come from a private account she couldn't trace. Even after her mother had passed, the house had been quietly sold, and she had received just enough inheritance to live comfortably but not extravagantly. Someone had been watching over them. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to decide what to search next. And then she typed a name she hadn't thought of in years. Frederick Wyndham. She barely knew him. A shadowy figure from her childhood, rarely spoken about, never present in person but always there in some unspoken way. Her mother had never mentioned him much, only in passing, and when she did, there was always a strange tightness in her voice. Maddie remembered him only as an absence, a name murmured at the end of phone calls, an occasional guest at the estate she had lived in when she was little. The search results told her everything she needed to know. Frederick Wyndham wasn't just some wealthy benefactor. He was one of the most powerful men in the city, a figure who sat on the boards of multiple industries: finance, real estate, philanthropy. He was known for his cold, calculated demeanor, the type of man who made empires rise and fall with a signature. And he had been connected to her life this whole time. Her pulse pounded. She closed her laptop, grabbed her coat, and headed for the Wyndham Tower, a skyscraper so polished it reflected the sky like a mirror. The receptionist barely looked up before recognizing Maddie's name. "Mr. Wyndham has been expecting you," she said, pressing a button on her phone. Maddie's breath caught. Expecting her? Before she could process that, a sleek assistant arrived to escort her to the top floor. The ride in the private elevator was silent, the walls reflective, her own face staring back at her. She looked composed, but inside, her stomach twisted. The office was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't flashy, not ostentatious like she had expected from a man of his wealth. It was practical, almost minimalist: dark wood, leather chairs, an expansive window overlooking the city. And there he was. Frederick Wyndham sat behind a heavy desk, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit perfectly tailored. He was older than she remembered, but his presence was just as formidable. He barely glanced up from the document he was signing. "You took longer than I expected," he said. Maddie froze in the doorway. The way he spoke, as if this was inevitable, as if he had been waiting for her, made her blood boil. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I want answers." Finally, he looked at her. His gaze was sharp, assessing, but not surprised. "I assumed you would," he said, setting his pen down. He gestured for her to sit, but she didn't move. "I don't need a seat," she said. "I need the truth." Fred sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You always had your mother's stubbornness." Maddie clenched her fists. "Don't talk about my mother like you knew her." At that, his expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of something unreadable. "I knew her better than you think," he said. "Your mother worked for my family for many years. She was my mother's primary caregiver after the burglary." Maddie's breath caught. She knew about the burglary, of course. It was a defining tragedy in the Wyndham family history, a home invasion gone wrong, one that had left Fred's mother bedridden until her passing years later. "She wasn't just an employee," Fred continued. "She was trusted." There was something in the way he said it, something weighted. Maddie didn't interrupt. "She lived on our estate," he said. "And during that time, she became involved with my younger brother, Nathaniel." Maddie felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her mother had never spoken of Nathaniel Wyndham. She had always told Maddie that her father was a man who couldn't be in their lives. There had never been details. Never a name. She swallowed. He was married. Yes. The confirmation felt like a slap. Fred's face remained unreadable. "Nathaniel was not meant for the responsibilities of our family. He traveled. He made choices that weren't always wise. Your mother loved him, I believe. And when she became pregnant, she didn't ask him for anything." Maddie's throat tightened. "She stayed on the estate for the first few years of your life," he continued. "After my mother passed, she decided to leave." Maddie's voice was barely a whisper. "Why didn't you stop her?" Fred gave her a long, considering look. "Because I don't own people." The irony of that statement was almost laughable, given the circumstances. "But my mother's will," he continued, "had already been written. She had grown attached to your mother, to you. And she wanted to ensure you were provided for." Maddie shook her head. "Provided for? You call this provision? You call shaping my entire life provision?" Fred didn't react. "We ensured opportunities were open to you. You didn't have to take them. But you did." Maddie's stomach churned. Her entire life, every success, every decision, had never been just hers. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke again. Why didn't you ever tell me? Fred exhaled slowly. Because it wasn't necessary. Until now. Maddie barely heard him. Her mind was racing, replaying every moment she had thought she had earned on her own. She forced herself to meet his gaze. What now? Fred steepled his fingers. Now, you make a choice. Maddie's chest tightened. You can walk away, Fred said. Cut ties. We will not interfere again. But you will never receive another opportunity, not for yourself, and not for Levi. A cold weight settled in her stomach. Or, he continued, you accept what was promised. You continue as you are, with all the benefits that entails. Maddie's pulse pounded. She wanted to shout, rage, demand more options, but the truth was, there weren't any. Her life wasn't hers alone anymore. And Levi's future now rested in her hands. Maddie walked out of Wyndham Tower and into the bright, indifferent city, her heart hammering in her chest. The crisp air stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. The streets buzzed around her, people weaving through crosswalks, taxis honking impatiently, couples arguing over dinner plans. Everything was normal, yet nothing felt that way. The ground beneath her feet might as well have been shifting. She moved automatically, stepping onto the sidewalk, blending into the crowd. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she needed to get away from that office, that man, those choices. You have a decision to make, Fred had said, his voice so maddeningly even. He had said it with the calm detachment of a man who had nothing at stake, as if he were explaining investment options rather than appending her entire sense of self. She could leave, he had told her. Walk away. Cut ties, refuse another cent, erase the invisible hand that had been guiding her life. Or she could accept what was promised, continue to reap the benefits of decisions made long before she was even born. And Levi. Levi would be protected. Her stomach twisted. The word protected clung to her. It made her furious. It made her afraid. Because what kind of mother knowingly gambled with her son's future? She was 3 blocks away before she realized where her feet had taken her. Elena's Cafe. The little shop was tucked between a bookstore and an overpriced boutique, a place that smelled like cinnamon and roasted coffee beans, where the chairs wobbled slightly and the baristas knew her order before she even said it. She hesitated at the door, still feeling as if her body was running on autopilot, and then she stepped inside. Elena was behind the counter, laughing at something one of her employees had said, her dark curls piled in a loose bun on top of her head. The moment she spotted Maddie, her expression shifted. Oh no, she said, tugging off her apron. That is the face of someone who has been given deeply upsetting news. Elena, Maddie's voice cracked. She didn't even know how to say it. Elena didn't wait for an explanation. Danny, can you cover for a bit? She called over her shoulder before grabbing Maddie's hand and pulling her toward the corner booth. Maddie sat down heavily, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. I don't even know where to start. Elena waved at a server. Get her something strong. Something with double the espresso. She looks like she just found out her whole life is a simulation. Maddie let out a weak laugh. It might as well be. Elena leaned in. Talk to me. So she did. Everything spilled out. The letter. The Wyndham family. The deal her mother had been part of. Fred's unbothered explanation. The reality that her entire life, every opportunity, every job, every stroke of luck, had been carefully placed before her. By the time she finished, Elena had gone from shock to disbelief to a kind of hushed horror. Holy, Elena exhaled, shaking her head. This is insane. Maddie stared down at the chipped edge of the table. Yeah. Elena leaned back, running a hand over her face. So what are you going to do? Maddie let out a hollow laugh. I have no idea. Elena narrowed her eyes. Okay, let's break this down. The way I see it, you have two options. 1, you walk away. You do everything on your own. No safety net. No guarantee that Levi gets the kind of life you want for him. Maddie's stomach twisted. Elena held up a hand. Or 2, you accept the money and keep things exactly as they are. You get to give Levi every opportunity, make sure he's set up for the future. And all you have to do is, what, exactly? Keep living your life? Maddie bristled. It's not just that. Elena tilted her head. Isn't it? Maddie wanted to argue. She wanted to push back, to say that it wasn't that simple, that accepting the money meant accepting that she was part of this world, part of this story that had started before she was even born. I'd be controlled, Maddie said, her voice tight. Elena gave her a long look. Or you'd just be practical. Maddie looked up sharply. You're lucky, Elena said, and there was no cruelty in it, only blunt honesty. Most single moms don't have this choice. Maddie swallowed hard. She knew that. She knew it. She thought of the other moms at Levi's school, the ones who barely made it through the month, the ones who picked up extra shifts and worked second jobs and pinched every penny just to keep up. She thought of the nights she had seen them at parent meetings, exhausted but pushing through because they had no other option. She had never had to struggle like that. But not because she worked harder. Not because she was smarter. Because this had always been arranged. Maddie gripped the edge of the table. You think I should just take the money? Elena sighed. I think you should stop feeling guilty for an opportunity that was given to you. Maddie clenched her jaw. That was easy to say. It was a lot harder to live with. She shoved a hand through her hair, glancing out the window. Where are you going? Elena asked as Maddie stood abruptly. I need to think. Elena let out a low whistle. That doesn't sound ominous at all. Maddie ignored her, grabbing her coat and heading out the door. She drove without thinking, the streets blurring around her, until she found herself outside Levi's school. It was late afternoon, the golden light stretching long shadows over the pavement. The playground was lively, kids shouting, sneakers slamming against pavement, voices rising in excitement. And there was Levi. 11 years old. Running across the field, laughing as he kicked a soccer ball, his entire face lit up with carefree joy. Maddie gripped the steering wheel, something heavy pressing against her chest. She watched as he passed the ball to one of his friends, no worries, no fears, no idea that his future might change forever depending on what she chose in the next few days. Her stomach turned. How could she take this away from him? How could she let herself be trapped in someone else's decisions forever? She had always believed she was the one who shaped their life. That she was the one providing, working, making it all happen. But now? Now she didn't even know if any of it had been real. Levi scored a goal, throwing his hands in the air triumphantly, and one of his friends tackled him in a hug. He was happy. He was safe. Maddie pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, her heart pounding. How did she choose? How was she supposed to decide something this big? The laughter from the playground rang in her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, knowing that whatever she chose next would change everything. Maddie stepped into Fred Wyndham's office, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure if she had convinced herself that this was a good idea or if she was running purely on instinct. Either way, there was no turning back now. Fred barely looked up when she entered, flipping through papers with the kind of measured ease that only came with years of power. He exuded control in a way that irritated her, as if nothing ever surprised him, as if people moved around him like chess pieces. She knew she was one of those pieces, had been since before she was born, but she was done playing by his rules. You've decided, he said, still scanning a document. Maddie sat but didn't relax. I have. He finally set the papers aside, folding his hands in front of him. And? She took a breath. I'm not taking the inheritance. His expression didn't change. Not even a flicker of surprise. That irritated her more than anything. No, he said, tilting his head slightly. No. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to her frustration, the barest hint of amusement touched his features. Interesting. I assumed you would take the practical route. Maddie leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. This is the practical route. His lips twitched, like he was holding back a smirk. Enlighten me. She straightened her shoulders. I don't want money I didn't earn. But if you truly believe I was meant to succeed, then invest in my business. That got a reaction. His expression didn't shift much, but she saw the way his fingers tapped once against the desk, the way his eyes narrowed just slightly. You want me to back a business that doesn't exist yet, he said. Yes. He leaned back, studying her. You understand what you're asking? I do. And if you fail? Maddie held his gaze. Then I fail. Fred let out a low chuckle. You're very sure of yourself. She tilted her head. You're the one who said I was meant for success. He considered her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he opened his desk drawer, pulled out a leather-bound notebook, and flipped to a blank page. I'll invest, he said. But on one condition. Maddie braced herself. If you fail, you can't come running back, he said, pen poised above the page. No second chances. No safety nets. If you fall alone. Her stomach clenched, but she nodded. Deal. Fred nodded once, jotted something down, tore out the page, and slid it across the desk. Then let's see what you can do. Maddie took the paper, feeling the weight of it in her hands. This was hers now. Truly hers. She walked out of the office, already thinking of what came next. She didn't sleep for weeks. The idea had been simple enough in theory: start a business, build something of her own, prove she was more than an inheritance she never asked for. But in reality? In reality, it was exhausting, brutal, relentless work. She sketched plans at the kitchen table, stayed up until dawn researching, held meetings in coffee shops with potential partners who barely gave her a second glance. She had Levi to take care of, bills to pay, a house to maintain, and now, she had this. A business that didn't even exist yet. She used Fred's investment sparingly, afraid of wasting a dollar. She hired the smallest team possible, people like her, people who had something to prove. The first year was a disaster. The second was worse. She ran out of money twice, nearly gave up 5 times, cried in her car more times than she could count. She missed parent-teacher conferences, forgot birthdays, lost whole weekends to stress. She watched people quit, watched competitors outpace her, watched deadlines inch closer with no solutions in sight. Then, slowly, painfully, things began to shift. She landed a breakthrough client. Then another. Her team grew. Investors, real ones, not just Fred, started calling. She worked harder than she ever had in her life. She built something out of nothing, poured every ounce of herself into the business, made it into something she could be proud of. And then, when it was finally stable, when it was finally successful, she did something no one expected. She gave it away. The announcement hit the business world like a bombshell. Maddie Carter, founder and CEO, was handing over full ownership of her company to her employees. People thought it was a joke at first. Then they thought she had lost her mind. Fred Wyndham did not look amused. He called her the next morning. "You're playing games with my investments," he said. Maddie smiled, sitting in her office, her former office, her feet propped up on the desk that wasn't hers anymore. I'm playing by the rules you set. Fred exhaled sharply through his nose. You never said anything about. I never said I'd keep it, Maddie interrupted. I said I'd build it. I did. Silence. Then, to her utter shock, he laughed. A quiet, disbelieving laugh. Well, he said finally. I can't say I saw this coming. Maddie grinned. That's the best part. Fred sighed. What's your plan now? Maddie leaned back in the chair. I'm starting another company. Fred groaned. Maddie laughed, and for the first time in years, she felt completely, undeniably free. Maddie didn't stop at one company. She didn't stop at two. She had no intention of stopping at all. The moment she handed over the keys to her second company, she knew exactly what she was going to do next. People thought it was a fluke the first time, an impulsive decision from an entrepreneur who had no idea what she was doing. But twice? That was a pattern, and people didn't know what to make of it. The business world wasn't built for people like her. It was built for those who climbed, hoarded, expanded, and never let go. But Maddie had found a different way to win, one that made no sense to investors and no sense to Fred Wyndham, who had been watching her with a mix of fascination and exasperation. She built again. She knew how to start from scratch now, knew how to scale quickly, how to structure deals that worked in her favor. This time, she launched something in sustainable products, a sector she had zero experience in but was smart enough to surround herself with people who did. She stayed up late researching supply chains, market trends, eco-friendly materials, things she had never even considered before. The work was just as exhausting, just as brutal, just as all-consuming as before. There were months of feeling like she was running uphill in the rain, times when suppliers bailed, when manufacturing costs ballooned overnight, when her team doubted whether this would ever get off the ground. Maddie doubted it too. But she had done this before. She kept going. She brought in new investors, struck partnerships, made deals that made no sense on paper but worked in execution. She cut waste, found creative solutions, hustled until the company wasn't just staying afloat but leading the industry. And then, just as the business started printing money, just as it became something people fought to buy into, she did what no one saw coming. She handed it over. The employees now owned the company. Maddie stepped back, wiped her hands, and walked away. The reaction was bigger this time. The business media had ignored her at first, but this was different. She was no longer an anomaly, she was a force. They started calling her the entrepreneur who gives it all away, writing headlines that made her sound like some kind of tech world folk hero or a woman who had lost her mind. Fred called, as expected. I'm beginning to think you're addicted to doing this, he said, his tone a mix of frustration and something close to amusement. I wouldn't call it an addiction, Maddie said, stretching on her couch, Levi's soccer cleats abandoned on the floor next to her. More of a passion. Fred let out a slow breath. You realize no one does this, right? That's what makes it fun. I don't think fun is the word I'd use. Maddie smirked. Well, you're the one who gave me capital. You should have asked what I planned to do with it. Silence. Then, to her absolute shock, he laughed. A quiet, disbelieving laugh. Well, he said finally. I can't say I saw this coming. That's the best part. Fred sighed. What's your plan now? She could hear the resigned curiosity in his voice, as if he already knew what she was going to say but needed to hear it anyway. I'm starting another company. Fred groaned. Maddie. What? She said, grinning. You're the one who said I was meant to succeed. I'm just proving you right. Fred muttered something under his breath, but she didn't catch it. She hung up, still grinning. It wasn't about starting businesses anymore. It was about changing the system. People had started reaching out to her. Young entrepreneurs, people with ideas but no connections, people who had been shut out of opportunities because they didn't come from wealth or privilege. At first, she had just responded to emails here and there, offering advice, directing them to resources. Then she started taking meetings. Then she started mentoring. The idea for mentoring started almost by accident. It began with an email, a young woman who had read about Maddie's unconventional business model, asking if she could spare some advice. Maddie had nearly ignored it, assuming it was just another reporter fishing for a quote, but something about the email felt different. The woman, barely out of college, had tried to launch a sustainable clothing brand but had been shut out by investors who wanted too much control. Maddie sent a short response with a few resources, expecting that to be the end of it. But then came another email, then another. Soon, more messages flooded in, all from people with ideas but no access, ambition but no connections. It was the same pattern over and over, talented people locked out of opportunities because they didn't come from the right background, the right schools, the right families. Maddie had spent her whole life unknowingly benefiting from the opposite. Doors had been quietly opened for her before she even knew they existed. Now, she couldn't stop seeing the people standing outside those same doors, waiting for someone to let them in. She started small, answering emails in the late hours of the night, offering insights between meetings and school drop-offs. But soon, one-on-one advice wasn't enough. These weren't just individual struggles, this was a systemic issue, one that had been keeping out voices that could have reshaped industries if they'd just been given a fraction of the chances Maddie had unknowingly received. So, she structured her mentoring into something more tangible, more actionable. She set up weekly online Q&A sessions, where aspiring entrepreneurs could log in and ask her anything, real, unfiltered questions, not the polished answers found in business school textbooks. She started workshops in local co-working spaces, gathering small groups of people who had ideas but no roadmap. She taught them the things no one had taught her: how to negotiate a contract without losing control, how to recognize bad investors, how to grow a business without selling your soul. At first, she thought it would be a side project, something she did when she had time, a way to give back before she moved on to her next company. But it didn't stay small. People started talking about it, sharing what they had learned, telling others about this woman who built and gave away businesses but stayed behind to make sure others knew how to do it too. More entrepreneurs reached out. Soon, larger organizations took notice. Universities invited her to speak. Investors, some of the same ones who had doubted her methods, began attending her sessions just to understand why so many people were suddenly listening to Maddie Carter. What had started as a handful of emails became something bigger, something that no longer belonged to just her. She wasn't just mentoring entrepreneurs anymore. She was creating a blueprint for a new way of doing business. One where success wasn't hoarded, where power wasn't locked away by a handful of gatekeepers. The more people she helped, the more she realized this was her real work. Not just building companies, but building people who would build companies. She had spent years proving to herself that she could succeed without the safety net she had unknowingly been given. Now, she was proving that the next generation of entrepreneurs shouldn't need a secret inheritance or an invisible hand guiding them. She kept mentoring, expanding the program, turning it into something bigger than herself. She built a network, connecting people who had once been competing for scraps and showing them they could build something stronger together. She found funding for startups that would have been ignored, she called out the investors who preyed on desperate founders, and she made sure that anyone with an idea had a place to learn how to make it real. Eventually, people stopped asking when she would build her next company. They started asking when she would build the next movement. And that was the moment Maddie knew she had finally found something worth keeping. Levi started watching her more closely. He was getting older now. Not just a kid she tucked into bed at night, but a teenager who was starting to see the world differently. He would sit at the kitchen table while she took calls, ask about her decisions, challenge her on strategies. One night, after she had wrapped up a meeting with a young entrepreneur trying to launch a community-focused grocery initiative, Levi leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So, what do you actually get out of this? She raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? He shrugged. You're giving everything away. What's the point? Maddie set down her mug. What do you think the point is? Levi hesitated, then sat down. I don't know. I just don't get why you wouldn't keep even one of the businesses. Maddie thought for a moment. You like soccer, right? Levi frowned. Yeah. You love playing. The competition, the game, the feeling of scoring. He nodded. But do you want to own the team? Run the stadium? His nose scrunched. No. She smiled. Exactly. Levi stared at her for a long moment, then huffed. That's such a weird way to explain it. Maddie laughed. It's the best I've got. He rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed a notebook from the counter. I had an idea for something, he said, flipping through the pages. You want to hear it? Maddie felt something settle deep in her chest, something that felt a lot like victory. She leaned in. Yeah, bud. Tell me everything. Levi turned 16 on a Wednesday. Maddie had planned a dinner at his favorite burger place, nothing extravagant, just a few close friends, Elena, and an unnecessary amount of fries. He had made it clear he didn't want a big party, and Maddie, respecting his growing independence, kept it simple. 16 was a strange age. He wasn't a kid anymore, but he wasn't quite grown either. She saw it in the way he moved, how his voice had deepened, how his sharp opinions took shape in ways that surprised her. The dinner was easy, filled with laughter, jokes about how Levi could legally learn to drive now, something Maddie wasn't emotionally prepared for. The boys devoured their weight in food, and Elena gave a dramatic toast that had Levi rolling his eyes but grinning all the same. It was a good night. A normal night. But as they got home and Levi kicked off his shoes in the hallway, Maddie felt it pressing on her. The secret she had carried for years, the thing she had convinced herself could wait. But it couldn't. Not anymore. He was old enough now. Old enough to see the world for what it was. Old enough to question where they really came from. Levi flopped onto the couch, stretching his long legs out, absently scrolling through his phone. You've been weird all day, he said, not looking up. Maddie forced a laugh. I have not. You totally have. He glanced at her. What's up? She sat down, her hands tightening against her lap. There's something I need to tell you. Levi locked his phone and tossed it aside, sitting up straighter. Okay. Maddie took a breath. It's about our family. And about something I've kept from you. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? She started from the beginning. She told him about her mother, his grandmother, and the life she had lived before Maddie was even born. She told him about the Wyndham family, about the deal that had shaped their lives, about the money she had refused to take, the choices that had never really been hers to make. Levi didn't say a word as she spoke. His expression didn't shift, didn't flicker. He just sat there, still, his fingers pressed into his knees. When she finally finished, the silence between them was too loud, too heavy. So, Levi said finally, his voice low. Everything we had wasn't real? Maddie's heart clenched. It was real. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Was it? Yes. She leaned forward. Everything I built was mine. I worked for it, Levi. But you had a head start, he said, his voice rising slightly. Right? Someone was always pulling strings. Making things easier. It was all just set up for you. Maddie swallowed. I didn't know for a long time. I thought we were just lucky? Levi cut in, shaking his head. That's what you told me, Mom. Work hard, make smart choices, and things will work out. He pushed off the couch and paced the living room, his hands gripping his hair. But that's not what happened. You didn't just work hard. You were being protected. You had a way out if you ever failed. That's not the same thing. Maddie's stomach twisted. I walked away, she said softly. But did it even matter? He turned to face her, anger flashing in his eyes. Even when you walked away, even when you thought you were independent, they were still there. You just didn't see it. Maddie had nothing to say to that. Levi exhaled sharply and grabbed his jacket. Levi, where are you going? I need some air. It's late. I'll be back. And then he was gone. Maddie sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been, feeling something deep inside her crack open. She checked her phone every few minutes, willing herself to stay calm. He would come back soon. He just needed space. But an hour passed. Then another. Then the rain started. Not a drizzle. A downpour. She grabbed her coat, barely remembering to lock the door behind her. She found him a few blocks away, sitting on a bench, drenched, his hair clinging to his forehead. His shoes were soaked, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and his eyes fixed on the skyline, watching the blinking lights of the city. Maddie hesitated. Then she sat down next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Levi exhaled. I don't want to live a life where someone else decides everything for me. Maddie closed her eyes briefly, the words hitting deep. That's why I walked away, she said. Levi shook his head. But it didn't change anything. We were still benefiting from it. Even without the money, they were still there. Controlling things. Even when we didn't know. She swallowed hard. He turned to her then, his face serious, his voice quieter. One day, I'm gonna have to decide, right? Maddie felt something collapse inside her. She had spent years thinking it was her choice, her burden. But of course, it wasn't. Levi had been born into it, whether he wanted it or not. I don't want their money, Levi said. I don't want their help. But I don't even know if it's possible to escape them. Maddie reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. We'll figure it out, she said. Levi exhaled. Yeah. They sat there for a little while longer, rain soaking through their clothes, the city stretching out before them. A future full of decisions neither of them were ready to make. Maddie never expected Levi to take an interest in business. He had always been more focused on soccer, music, and whatever chaotic things teenage boys spent their time obsessing over. He liked to build things, sure, but real things, not companies. He was the kind of kid who took apart game controllers just to see if he could put them back together, who once tried to rig the microwave to work with voice commands. It had ended in minor sparks and a very irritated Maddie. But he had never cared about the kind of work she did. Not until now. At first, it was just curiosity. He lingered longer when she was on the phone, listening when she talked about contracts, deals, and partnerships. He started asking questions, not obvious ones, but the kind that made Maddie pause. Why do investors ask for so much control? Why do some companies scale too fast and then crash? Why do you always give away the businesses you build instead of selling them? The questions weren't casual. He wasn't just making conversation. One afternoon, she found him at the kitchen table with a notebook full of scribbled ideas. He had his head down, completely absorbed, his pen tapping lightly against the page as he thought. She leaned against the counter, watching him for a moment before finally speaking. What are you working on? Levi didn't look up. Just thinking. Thinking about what? He hesitated. I want to start something. Maddie blinked. Like a business? I guess, he said, still looking at his notes. I just feel like. I don't want to sit around waiting for life to happen to me. Maddie's heart clenched. She remembered that feeling. The restless urgency. The need to create something of your own before someone else shaped your life for you. Okay, she said. Then let's figure it out. She didn't throw him into the deep end. She started the way she wished someone had started with her, by teaching him how to see. Not just how to read a contract or build a business plan, but how to recognize opportunities, how to think like a builder instead of just a participant. She brought him into conversations, let him listen in on meetings, showed him how to break down an idea and test whether it had legs. At first, he mostly observed. Then, slowly, he started asking better questions, more technical ones. Questions that made her really explain why she made certain choices, why she turned down certain deals, why she refused to take money from investors who wanted too much influence. Maddie wasn't sure where this was going, but she knew one thing for certain: she would teach him everything she knew. As she worked on another company, Levi saw every step. He watched her assemble a team, not just hiring the most experienced people, but the ones who could think differently, who had something to prove, who were willing to take risks. He saw her deal with problems, unforeseen costs, delays, the kinds of fires that always seem to need putting out when running a business. He saw her negotiate, fight for control when she needed to, let go when it was the smarter move. And then, just like before, he watched her hand it over. She signed the final documents and stepped away, refusing to keep a single share. She walked away from something worth millions, just like she always did. Levi leaned against the office doorway, arms crossed. You really don't regret this? Maddie set the pen down and glanced at him. Regret what? Letting it go. You could be, you know. He gestured vaguely. A billionaire. She smiled. That was never the point. Levi frowned, like he was still trying to wrap his head around it. She could see the internal battle playing out on his face, the years of hearing what success was supposed to look like conflicting with what he had just witnessed. But a week later, he sat across from her at the dining table, his laptop open, a page full of notes pulled up on the screen. I have an idea, he said. Maddie leaned forward. Tell me. He hesitated, then took a breath. What if there was a way to help people like the ones you mentor? The ones who don't have connections or money but have ideas? What if we could create something that actually gets them resources, not just advice? Maddie's heart pounded. He wasn't asking how to make himself rich. He wasn't asking how to win the game. He was asking how to change it entirely. She had spent years fighting against the idea that success meant keeping power for yourself. And now, sitting across from her, Levi was proving that maybe, just maybe, it had worked. But as proud as she was, she couldn't shake the question that gnawed at her late at night. Would he be better off just taking the safety net? Would he regret walking away from something that could have made his life easier? Would he blame her for teaching him how to struggle instead of how to accept comfort when it was freely given? Levi didn't wait for her approval. He got to work. He researched everything: funding models, nonprofit structures, existing organizations that supported entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds. He spent nights sketching out a plan, refining it, crossing things out, rewriting them. He reached out to people Maddie had mentored in the past, asking what they wished they had had when they were starting out. Maddie watched him throw himself into it with the same relentless energy she had once poured into her own businesses, and she felt something deeper than pride. She saw a version of herself in him, not in the way he built things, but in why he wanted to build them in the first place. He wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing impact. But that fear never left her. One night, after Levi had spent hours at his laptop, buried in work, Maddie finally spoke. You know, she said carefully, you could have a very comfortable life if you just took what was offered. Levi looked up, blinking. What? She hesitated. You don't have to fight this hard. You don't have to struggle. The money is there, if you want it. Levi frowned. Why would I want it? To make things easier, she said. She stopped herself. Levi leaned back in his chair, watching her. You didn't take it. That's different. Is it? Maddie let out a slow breath. Levi shook his head. I don't want an easy life. I want a real one. Her throat tightened. Levi turned back to his screen, typing something into his notes. Besides, he said, almost as an afterthought, if I took the money, I'd be letting them win. Maddie wasn't sure if he meant the Wyndhams. Or the system. Or all the people who said success only belonged to those who were born into it. But she understood exactly what he meant. She had spent years choosing the harder path, carving out something that wasn't just handed to her. She had built and given it all away. And now, Levi was doing the same. She wasn't sure if she had passed down her strength or just her stubbornness. Maybe they were the same thing. She wasn't sure yet. But as she watched him get to work, she hoped, more than anything, that she had prepared him for whatever came next. Levi graduated on a humid June afternoon, standing tall in his navy blue cap and gown, shaking hands with school officials as if he had done it 1,000 times before. Maddie sat in the crowd, clapping until her hands hurt, ignoring the lump in her throat. She wasn't the crying at milestones type, but something about watching him cross that stage made her feel like the world was shifting beneath her feet. He wasn't just her son anymore. He was his own person, stepping into his own life. After the ceremony, they went to dinner, just the two of them. Levi had refused anything big. No party, no speeches. Just a meal at their favorite restaurant, the same place they had been going since he was little, where the waitstaff knew them by name and always gave them extra fries. He barely touched his food, picking at the edge of his burger before finally setting it down. I've been thinking about something, he said. Maddie took a sip of her iced tea. That's never a good way to start a conversation. He smirked. No, it's serious. She set her glass down, watching him. Okay. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Do you still need this inheritance? Maddie blinked. What? The money. The connection to them. Do you need it? Maddie stared at him, her chest tightening. She had spent years carrying this decision, bending the rules, finding ways to build her own success while never completely cutting the thread that tied them to the Wyndham family. It had always been a burden she carried alone. And now, Levi was offering to share the weight. Levi. I'm serious, he said. I don't want it. I never wanted it. But I know why you kept the option open. It was for me. Maddie felt her pulse in her ears. I don't need it, Levi continued. I don't need a safety net. You taught me how to stand on my own. So now I'm asking, why are we still letting this hang over us? Maddie let out a slow breath. She had fought so hard to prove that she could do this on her own. But there had always been that small, nagging fear. What if walking away completely was the wrong choice? What if she was making an emotional decision instead of a smart one? Levi was giving her permission to let it go. Maybe he had been ready for this moment before she was. She nodded. Okay. Levi raised an eyebrow. Okay. I'll take care of it. He studied her for a second, then grinned. I was expecting more drama. Oh, there will be drama, she said, picking up her burger. I just haven't decided if I'm throwing something at Fred's head yet. Levi laughed, and just like that, it was decided. The next morning, Maddie walked into Wyndham Tower one last time. The receptionist didn't even blink when she arrived. She was expected. Fred's assistant led her upstairs, where she was ushered into his office without ceremony. He was waiting, standing by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city like a king surveying his kingdom. Without turning, he said, "You've been planning this for years." Maddie crossed her arms. You don't seem surprised. I'm not. He finally turned to face her, the same unreadable expression on his face that had always irritated her. It was inevitable. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, tapping her fingers against the armrest. I'm here to finalize everything, she said. I want to sign the paperwork, sever ties, make it official. Fred nodded once, like this was nothing more than closing out a business deal. He opened a drawer, pulled out a file, and set it in front of her. Maddie picked up the pen, staring down at the papers. It wasn't complicated. A few signatures, and it was done. She felt something tighten in her chest, both freedom and terror all at once. She had spent years navigating this invisible thread that had tied them to the Wyndhams. Now, she was about to cut it. Permanently. No one was stopping her. No one was telling her it was a mistake. She could have walked away a long time ago. But it had never felt like the right time. There was always an excuse, always a reason to keep the option open, always that small whisper of what if. But she didn't need to ask what if anymore. She signed the first page. Then the second. Then the last. She set the pen down and let out a slow breath. Fred leaned back in his chair, watching her with something close to amusement. You really think I lost? Maddie met his gaze, the final weight lifting from her shoulders. I think we both won. Fred smirked. Maddie stood, grabbed her bag, and walked out of his office without looking back. Maddie had expected something to change after she signed the papers. Some grand, dramatic shift, like a weight lifting off her chest or the world tilting on its axis. But the morning after was just like any other. The sun rose. Levi left his cereal bowl in the sink even though the dishwasher was right there. Her inbox was still flooded with emails from entrepreneurs looking for advice. And yet, something had changed. She moved through the morning with a strange sense of lightness, as if she had been carrying something heavy for years without realizing it, and now that it was gone, she wasn't quite sure what to do with herself. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove something, to herself, to Fred, to the world. She had fought to succeed without relying on what had been secretly arranged for her, fought to step out of the long shadow cast by a family she had never truly belonged to. Now, there was no more fight left. Because she had won. And the best part? So had Levi. For years, she had made decisions with him in mind, always balancing between independence and security, always questioning if she was doing the right thing. Now, there were no more invisible strings. No more lingering what-ifs. They were truly free. Levi left for college with a small suitcase, an old backpack, and a plan that was entirely his own. He didn't have a trust fund or family money to fall back on, but he didn't need it. He knew how to build. She had made sure of that. Maddie watched him pack up his things, the same way she had watched him tie his shoes for the first time when he was little, proud, a little sad, resisting the urge to step in and do it for him. You good? She asked, leaning against the doorway of his bedroom. Levi glanced up from his half-zipped duffel bag, smirking. Mom, I've been moving toward this since I was, 10. She rolled her eyes but smiled. I just mean, do you have everything? Probably not, he admitted. But I'll figure it out. Maddie exhaled, crossing her arms. Yeah. You will. Levi sat down on the edge of the bed, watching her carefully. You're gonna be okay, right? She frowned. Of course I am. He gave her a look. Levi, I'm not some tragic empty nester. I have things to do. He snorted. Yeah. More companies to give away. Exactly, she said. It's kind of my thing. And it was. She didn't stop building just because she had nothing left to prove. She kept starting companies and handing them over, kept mentoring people who would have never been given a chance otherwise. The more she did it, the more people started to understand what she had been trying to do all along. At first, the business world had written her off as an anomaly, a strange experiment, an entrepreneur who clearly didn't know how wealth was supposed to work. But then, her model started spreading. The businesses she had started kept thriving under their new owners, proving that profit and power didn't have to be hoarded to be successful. Maddie still remembered the first time an up-and-coming investor had approached her at a conference, shifting awkwardly before finally asking, "So, how do you pick who gets to take over your companies?" Maddie had sipped her coffee, pretending to consider the question. "I don't pick them," she had said. "They build it alongside me. It belongs to them from the start." The investor had blinked. "But, how do you make money?" Maddie had laughed. "I do just fine." That was the thing. She hadn't walked away with nothing. She had simply chosen a different kind of success, one that couldn't be measured in stocks or profit margins. And now, she was watching that success spread. She still got emails from Fred sometimes. Not many. He was never the kind of man to keep in touch for the sake of it. But every now and then, there would be an article about her in the business section, and a few days later, she would get a terse, vaguely amused text. "You're causing trouble again." Maddie always responded the same way. "That's the idea." Years passed. Levi carved his own path, launching his own nonprofit initiative, expanding the mentoring work Maddie had started. She watched from a distance, never interfering, never telling him how to do it. He didn't need her to. He was shaping something that was his, not hers. One evening, she was sitting on her porch, watching the sky fade into warm oranges and purples, when she checked the mail and found a letter with no return address. She already knew who it was from. Inside, there was only one sentence. "You were never meant to be owned." Maddie stared at the words for a long time, turning them over in her mind. She had spent so many years fighting against that ownership, proving that she didn't belong to the Wyndhams, didn't belong to anyone's expectations but her own. And now, after everything, even Fred had admitted it. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Then she smiled. Because she had finally won.